Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I'm Beau Perschbacher with the Washington State Department of Licensing. This is the first of 6 public hearings we're having throughout the state. On the marking, we're going to be putting on standard driver's license and ID cards as part of Real ID implementation. So kind of how we have the public hearing broken down today, we're going to do a general presentation on Real ID, followed by some time for questions. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to start the formal public hearing, where we'll have people signing in, providing comment on the record about the marking. So this first presentation is just designed to give you some context, background on Real ID, what the marking will be, so to help inform that discussion and get any other questions out of the way before we start taking comments on the record. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going over, some Real ID background, talking about Washington's approach to Real ID, because not all states are implementing it the same way. So it's important to understand how Washington's implementing it and what your options are. We're going to be talking specifically about the marking that's going to go on the standard documents and what some of the enforcement dates are. This can be sometimes confusing with states' extension status and the final enforcement. So we'll provide the breakdown on that and the dates you really need to remember. Finally, just doing some key takeaways, and then also, of course, question and answer. So going to the Real ID background, this whole process really started with the 9/11 Commission report back in 2004, which had recommended the federal government look at providing some set standards for the issuance of certain source documents, such as birth certificates and driver's licenses. And so in 2005, so a pretty long time ago, Congress passed the Real ID Act. What this did is it established some standards for documents that will be accepted by federal agencies. These will be sort of known as our Real ID compliant documents. We'll explain some more about what that means in a couple minutes. And states have to meet some of these standards to be recognized as Real ID compliant. And we'll have a map so you can see sort of where all the states are in this process. And the idea is that they're going to be recognized as Real ID compliant if they follow certain guidelines for issuing Real ID compliant documents and also marking documents that aren't Real ID compliant. So we refer to those in the presentation as the standard documents. And so these Real ID compliant documents are required for certain federal purposes. And the biggest one that you want to remember is domestic flights. So that's the key piece that will impact most Washington residents. The other ones are accessing certain federal facilities. That would be like secure federal facilities like a military base. This doesn't mean that you can't get into a post office or something without a Real ID compliant document. So there's a lot of federal buildings you can still access, but it's certain secure facilities. Also access to nuclear power plants. Most of us don't spend a lot of time in those. So again, the really important one to remember is domestic air travel. That's what's going to impact most Washington residents, is being able to get on a plane, get through that TSA checkpoint. Do you have the documentation you need to get on that flight? So you're not at the airport at the last minute and you realize, oh my gosh, I don't have what I need to fly. So this is sort of a little example of what kind of Real ID compliant documents are about. And it does require proof of identity and lawful status. And there are specific card design features that you're going to see. And when we show some examples of the enhanced driver's license, you can see some of these. But it's certain anti-counterfeit markings that are on there, certain symbols that they've approved. And there's also safeguards for issuance and production of the licenses. And that deals with certain source documents you have to present when you're going to get a Real ID compliant document, and those have to be retained for a certain amount of time. So there are standards that the Department of Homeland Security has set over all these issues, and part of our Real ID compliance is making sure that we line up with all those restrictions and regulations they have set for the states. A couple things, though, that I want to clarify that Real ID does not do. It's not a national ID card. And so states are continuing to issue driver's licenses and identification cards. Washington will have the enhanced driver's license that we'll talk about in a minute, and the standard driver's license. Those are still issued by the state of Washington. Those are not issued by Homeland Security. It doesn't authorize Homeland Security to regulate the issuance of driver's licenses. So if we do want to have a Real ID compliant document, which Washington does, we do have to follow certain regulations they've set, but our standard driver's license, we can still issue that as a state with our own state regulations, but we do have to mark them. And that is one thing that we're talking about specifically today, is that proposed marking that's going to be on standard documents. So for Washington State's approach, we had some significant legislation passed in 2017 that allowed us to become a Real ID compliant state. And one of those major pieces was beginning July 1st of this year, we're going to put that marking on standard documents. And federal limits apply is what we have. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But that is a key piece that we need in order to apply for Real ID compliance. The other one is some of the system changes that we're going to make when we roll out our new operating system in September that will allow us to apply for compliance. Key pieces of that legislation, it specifies the standard marking. It cannot be used as evidence or as a basis to infer an individual's citizenship or immigration status for any purpose. And it also, that legislation, it lowered the cost of the enhanced identification, of the enhanced driver's license and the enhanced identification card. So that was just part of the legislature's decision when they passed that. So one of the key messages we've been communicating to the public around the Real ID implementation is that you don't have to get an enhanced driver's license or ID card. It's certainly an option, but there are a variety of documents you can use once the enforcement for the domestic travel restrictions goes into place. So primarily that's those domestic flights. The enhanced driver's license and ID, that's one option you can do. You'll be able to use that to get on a plane to board a domestic flight once the enforcement begins. But there are other things that you can still use. And here are some examples of those. You might have a passport already, or maybe military ID. You could have a federally recognized tribal ID card. It's got a photo on it. You could use any of those, and that would also allow you to get on the plane and fly once the Real ID enforcement takes effect. Now, some people may opt to get the enhanced driver's license or ID card. That is the only state-issued document that we have. So all those other ones are issued by other entities. So if you're kind of looking to the Department of Licensing is the place you want to go to get that, that's what your option is. But it's not the only option. And that's really what we want to stress, is that there are a variety of ways that you can get ready for the Real ID enforcement and how you want to handle that. And so these are some examples of Washington's Real ID compliant documents. You see we've got the enhanced driver's license here and the enhanced ID card. What these require is a proof of citizenship, identity, and residence. Our website's got all the information you need about what specific documents you can take into a Department of Licensing office. In order to get one of those, some of the common source documents would be like a birth certificate, a passport. The whole list is online, and it sort of lays out all the different items you need, what the cost is. The key piece, I think, is to just make sure you look online before you come in to get one, to make sure you've got all the documents ahead of time so you don't have to come back for a second trip. We want to make it as easy as possible if you do want to get one of these documents that you've got everything you need beforehand. And the other example then is just the enhanced identification card. That's if you're not having the driving privilege, but you still want that document, which you can use for the travel when Real ID enforcement goes into effect.
So the list that's available online, is that in Spanish?
I believe the website can be...
The list that's available...
Oh, sure. Great point. So the question was, is the list of documents available in Spanish? And I believe on our website we do use the Google Translate, where you could select that you would like that page in Spanish. Okay, so these are the Real ID compliant documents that are issued by the state of Washington. Now, we also have the standard documents. These are the ones that are not Real ID compliant. This is what most of us have. This is what I have, just a standard driver's license and also the standard identification card. These do require proof of identity and residence, and all the information about how to obtain one of those is also available on our website. And so what's changing now, so most of us have this, and it looks like this. We're all familiar with what this looks like, I think. What's changing now as part of Real ID is that the Act requires us to mark on these driver's licenses, and this is sort of the language right out of the Real ID Act, that they're not, that it's not acceptable for official purposes. And whatever the state proposes as the marking, that has to be approved by the Department of Homeland Security. And so what Washington has proposed is this language of federal limits apply. And this marking has been previously approved by the Department of Homeland Security for California. So it's already in use, and that is what we put forward in the rulemaking that you'll be having an opportunity to comment on today, is your comments on the federal limit supply. So this is just a sample of what this could look like on the standard documents when we begin marking them in July of this year. Just to go back to California, you'll see a quick example here of what federal limit supply they have on theirs in the corner. And this is what Washington is proposing, working with our vendor, is the federal limit supply there on the driver's license and on the identification card. And sort of the positioning, text font, that's all set by a national organization we and all motor vehicle administrators are part of. And they work on sort of the standards for cards to make sure there's consistency, that it's in the machine readable zone is required by Homeland Security. So the enforcement dates. These are established by the Department of Homeland Security. I think in the past, one area of confusion has been, as Washington has been in different extensions with Homeland Security as we work to Real ID compliance. You might have seen signs around the airport saying, you know, starting January 22nd or maybe last October, you had to have a Real ID compliant document to get through the TSA security checkpoint. We've been working with them as we move towards Real ID compliance, and the key date that I want everyone to remember is October 2020. And so that is the final enforcement date for Real ID, when you will have to have a Real ID compliant document to get to that TSA security checkpoint at the airport. Now to move a little more to the inside baseball portion. So we currently have an extension with Homeland Security that expires October 2018. What we're planning as a state is when we roll out our new operating system in September, we will apply for Real ID compliance. And we expect that that will be accepted by Homeland Security. There may be a sort of time delay there as they review the application and process it. But the key date is October 2020. So we believe that there will be no enforcement of the Real ID requirement to get on a plane until that point. And that if we need to have another extension as they have time to review our application, that's not a problem. That will just be part of the process. And so that's the final enforcement date. That's the one we want everybody to remember, Real ID, October 2020. This is just a map of Real ID compliance throughout the states. You'll see the only state that's actually not compliant is American Samoa down here. Most of the states already are Real ID compliant, or they're in a similar situation as Washington where they're working towards becoming compliant. And like I said before, we're hoping that this September we can apply for compliance, that will be accepted, and then we'll be a state that's in green. Right. So another part of the general public education campaign for Real ID is focused on this ID 2020 campaign that we've been working on. And we plan to roll this out once we get through the rulemaking period, so that'll be about the end of May. And this is a combination of videos. We've got a microsite where we'll have different interactive things you can do to see what kind of documents you already have. Are you ready for Real ID? Do you need to get a new document? The content's translated into 4 different languages: Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Korean. We've been working closely with our partners at ports and airlines to have signage up at the airport, looking to see if we can have things on the plane, maybe in the seat back pocket, other areas that are frequented by travelers that are in a sort of visual, eye-catching way that discuss Real ID. So that's all part of what we plan to roll out, and you should start to see that as early as June, that some of that content will get pushed out to our partners. We'll do the internal training. So just to wrap it up, these are some of the key takeaways. Real ID impacts all U.S. states and territories, so it's not just Washington, it's everybody. We're going to put that marking on the standard documents in Washington beginning July 1st, 2018. The proposal is federal limit supply. You've kind of seen some of the examples of what that looks like, and that has to be approved by the Department of Homeland Security. So it's not something where Washington just chooses this is what it's going to be. There is that process with them. We're going to seek full compliance in September of this year. We're going to apply to Homeland Security. And of course, the drop dead date that impacts the general public the most is October 2020. That's the enforcement at airports where you have to have that Real ID compliant document in order to get on a plane to fly domestically. Standard documents can still be used for state identification and for many other purposes. It's just for the Real ID purposes that you can't use those. I think that's the last slide I had. So, a couple other things, more information. If you look on our website, just the very front page, we've got information on Real ID. We've got samples of the marking on the standard driver's licenses on there if you'd like to see those. If you're really curious about Real ID, Homeland Security also has a website. This is the microsite we'll be launching in June, id2020wa.com, so you can check that out. And if you are really curious, of course, there's always the Real ID Act language itself that you are welcome to read.